All good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting, and we are joined by one of the finest truth-tellers and myth-busters of our time. You all know him. He's the Canadian historian, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist thinker, activist, and founder of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and was a member of Disruption Canada. One of my favorite peoples in the world, Yves Engler. Welcome back to 1+1.
Thanks for having me, Youri.
Always a pleasure to have you. And Yves, I never do this because I always think it's going to take up too much time, but I really do want to take the time to do this. Yves is the author of several fantastic books, and I'm gonna read out the ones that I read in this order. Canada and Haiti, Waging a War on the Poor Majority, co-author with Anthony Fenton. The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, Canada and Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, Canada and Israel, Building Apartheid, Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping, The Truth May Hurt, A Propaganda System, How Canada's corporations, academia, media sell war and exploitation, The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, Stop Signs, Cars and Capitalism on the Road to Economic, Social, and Ecological Decay, with Yves' wife, past guest on the show, Bianca Mugieni. Sorry if I butchered her name. Left, Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, and Yves' latest book, which I've not gotten yet. Neither have I gotten his book, A Propaganda System, but House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. You guys need to get all of those books because they are fantastic. And so, once again, Yves, thanks for joining us on 1+1.
Thanks for having me.
So, Yves, it's every time there's a little bit of optimism that happens, there's a wave of pessimism which happens, and and it's fantastic. What you guys achieved with getting Canada not to have a seat at the United Nations Security Council. I thought that was a huge accomplishment for the anti-imperialist movement in Canada and the myth-busting movement in Canada. But some very sad news, which is Dimtri Lascaris and Meryam Haddad did not win the Green Party leadership contest. A very centrist Elizabeth May type of candidate won, Anamie Paul. However, Dimitri consistently got second place. Ms.Haddad didn't advance too much in the ranked choice voting, which I think is a pity, but oh well. So Yves, the first thing I want to talk about, and but let's not spend too much time talking about it, which is your reflections on your friend, our comrade, twice past guest on this show, Dimtri Lascaris. Him and Haddad not. Dimitri not winning, but getting second place consistently, and Ms. Haddad not advancing. Your overall response
it's of course very unfortunate. It was very close. It's what I expected. I thought Dimitri had a real shot of winning. He after the first round of voting, it was I think 6,200 for Anamie Paul and 5,800 for Dimitri. By the fourth, I think it was the fourth and fifth round of voting, he was actually in the lead. It was a ranked ballot voting system. And then on the final couple, including obviously the final ballot, he was down. Anamie had around 12,090, I believe it was, and Dimitri had 10,080 or something like that. So it was about a 2,000 vote gap difference. Dimitri did this with Elizabeth May, the outgoing leader of the party, and far and away the best associated, best known person within the Green Party, backing Anamie Paul very strongly, having supported her for a whole bunch of fundraising efforts.
Elizabeth May towards Anamie Paul.
Yeah. Towards Anamie Paul. Dimitri was, not allowed to run initially, so he was blocked initially from running, and then he had to contest his ability to even run. The party would block him. In the last couple days, there was a real attack against Dimitri with a smear piece on global news, on national news, claiming basically there was anti-Semitism problem within the Green Party and specifically going after Dimitri. And both Elizabeth May and Anamie Paul in that basically said they didn't believe that Dimitri should have been allowed to even run in the election. Justice Greens did a sort of data on Elizabeth May's Twitter account. Elizabeth May has like 330,000 Twitter followers, probably one of the most widely followed Twitter accounts among Canadian politicians. And they showed her Twitter, how much she retweeted the different candidates. And the top candidate was like 200 times, and Dimitri was 4 times. Right? She retweeted almost every tweet that Anamie Paul put out. Elizabeth May retweeted them, and she, it was like 1% or 0.5% of all the tweets that Dimitri put out. So just one example, and there were, like I mentioned, fundraising help for Anamie Paul, whole series of ways in which the party establishment, specifically Elizabeth May, worked on behalf of Anamie Paul and against Dimitri and Meryam, I think, to a slightly lesser extent. I don't think they ever.
Meryam Haddad, who, if somebody is a fan of Meryam Haddad, open invitation for her to come on the show. I've actually tried to invite her on the show, but without much luck. Anywho, but she also, like Dimitri, was definitely a social gadfly to the Green Party establishment, and just a couple of days about this was on the eve after the big Green Party leadership debate, which your organization did about foreign policy. She was temporarily suspended. Very much like how Dimitri is, but thanks to a lot of scorn and people complaining, she was allowed to run again. But yeah.
So basically, there was a lot of hostility from the Green Party leadership and establishment against breaking out of the box of official Canadian politics. Right, the Greens. They ran on a platform in the last election of not left, not right, forward. They are more progressive than most of Canadian political life. There's probably a few NDP MPs that are certainly on many issues, I would say, to the left of some of the Greens, but on broadly, the Greens, as left or more left-wing than any other party in the country. They do have some conservative, clearly right-wing factions within the party as well. And basically, what Dimitri was putting forward, and I think Meryam to a slightly lesser extent was putting forward, identifying as being an eco-socialist, identifying as saying, hey, capitalism is central part of the problem to the ecological crises, many ecological crises we're facing, that, we have a fundamentally problematic Canadian foreign policy. And not just that,
which is also very anti-ecological.
And also anti-ecological. Clearly, Canadian military bombing the hell out of Libya is, not good for the ecology there. But not only was Dimitri putting forward, in my opinion, better ideas and going to more of the root of issues at hand. He is somebody who has shown that he's willing to challenge power to move forward important ideas. So to me, it's like, Anamie Paul in her speech after victory, she talked about pharmacare, and she talked about I think maybe it was dental care, a few good like social democratic expansion of social entitlements that I think would be a big step forward for making the country a better place. But I don't trust that Anamie Paul is going to do the things that are required to make that realizable. So even that, social democratic gain, if you're really serious about pharmacare, you might have to, get arrested to push forward for pharmacare. You might have to, you're going to have to go to many demonstrations. You're going to have to go to different actions. You're going to have to. So if it was somebody who was a genuine social democrat, ecologically minded, let's say, social democrat, that was willing to, fight hard and the ways that are necessary to realize those social democratic gains, I would prefer someone like that over someone who spouted eco-socialism but wasn't really willing to challenge power to realize those gains. So I know Dimitri. I know Dimitri's been prepared to go in front of the prime minister and call out the prime minister at a public event for his anti-Palestinian positions. I know Dimitri has been willing to confront the prime minister on his pipeline policies and call him out in ways that are sort of socially awkward and that are considered taboo in official politics. So to me, it was clearly Dimitri's. Not only do I prefer his political outlook, brought his sort of ideology, but also that there was a concreteness to his actions and his willingness to challenge power. So it's very disappointing that he lost. It's also quite impressive how well he did. So you can look at it both ways. But obviously, it would have been a lot better if he would have won.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to get him back on the show, and hopefully Meryam Haddad, because being an independent journalist who the only thing I can really do is just go to particular Zoom events and stuff like that, just to monitor what's happening in Canadian politics and in other politics. And I know that both Dimitri and Meryam Haddad have given their congratulations to Anamie Paul. Both of them are going to continue to push the party into a proper eco-socialist, anti-imperialist direction, like the way the American Green Party has been with Jill Stein, Cynthia McKinney, Ralph Nader, and and other names like that. But I predict Anamie Paul. She's not going to replace the NDP as a third major party and a real force. If the Greens do advance in getting more people in Parliament, kudos to them. But I think that will probably be more having to do with what does Dimitri think of this candidate? What does Meryam Haddad think of that candidate? And are they offering anything more left than what the NDP are going to be proposing this time around? And the fact that Elizabeth May, who didn't get the party that far, and you can blame the first past the post system, but I think it has more to do with personality and some of her policies. That's just my humble opinion. Having someone who only got the Green Party to have 4 people as opposed to just 1 or 2 in Parliament. Anamie Paul, who was openly endorsed by Elizabeth May, and I'm pretty sure people like Adam West and David Murner and Glenn Murray. I'm pretty sure that the Green Party membership and the new voters that supported them probably thought, okay, my second choice would be Anamie Paul, and she's not going to become prime minister because on top of that, what is the point of having a Green Party which is which doesn't want to label itself eco-socialist and wants this broad church appealing to liberal and conservative and NDP voters? We already have a party like that. We already have a centrist party like that. It's called the Liberal Party, and the NDP is a diet liberal party at the best of times. Your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, David Murner, one of the other candidates, leading candidates, he ran for the Liberal Party 2 elections ago. Glenn Murray, he was another top candidate. He was in the cabinet of the Liberal government in Ontario. So yeah, I mean, I think that Anamie Paul winning was better than those two guys winning because they were both white men who were, explicitly identified with the Liberal Party, and she's not. I think to have a black woman win is a step forward. Yeah, I don't agree with Anamie Paul's politics. I think she's somebody who's very close to, Israel lobby crowd was backing her, right? Because there was a whole battle over boycott, divestment, sanctions within the Green Party going back a number of years. There's been a whole campaign against Dimitri.
And she is an imperialist, explicitly an imperialist, or is very much indifferent to it, as the Green Party debate on foreign policy showed.
Yeah, she worked at Global Affairs Canada, right? She worked for Canadian diplomacy, and she was based in Europe and then at the International Criminal Court. So she was right out of university. She went to work for the Canadian diplomatic apparatus. My sense of it is she's kind of like the sort of liberalish end of foreign policy diplomatic apparatus. But if you look at her position on the coup, which she was the foreign affairs critic for the Greens when the coup happened in Bolivia about a year ago, and her statement, now it was kind of what the Globe and Mail was saying at the time. It was what the New York Times was saying at the time. Now it's a very embarrassing statement because it's very clear that it's essentially going along with justification for the coup, and which is even collapsed within the New York Times and other kind of major outlets have now admitted that there really wasn't any problem with the elections that was being the justification for ousting Morales.
Extinction Rebellion still hasn't apologized for also regurgitating propaganda to oust Evo Morales.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think. I think that Anamie Paul, she's probably, her personal views are better than all but maybe 10 MPs in the House of Commons. I don't know, a handful of NDP MPs, maybe a couple of Bloc Québécois MPs who I would have more alignment with on their policies. I don't know, maybe she's the fifth. She'll be, if she was to win a seat in the House of Commons, she's the fifth best. I don't know. But anyways, but clearly not going in any sort of serious change in direction. And that was what the vision that Dimitri was putting forward was that you turn the Green Party into a activist, clearly left-wing eco-socialist party, and you try to rally the left-wing forces within the NDP that are unhappy with the many of the dubious positions the NDP has been taking, and you pursue it that way. I have to say, on a personal level, I'm not convinced that is a viable electoral strategy. I'm skeptical of, I think that the public has a lot of sympathy for the ideas
of the Green Party,
of eco-socialism, of even anti-imperialism, of certainly challenging capitalism, support for socialism. Corporations have too much power. A lot of the ideas that the left puts forward, there's a lot of sympathy among the public. I don't think that always translates into winning elections and winning positions in the House of Commons. I think the dynamic that process is about, I mean, just take the simplest part, which is an election sign, right? Election sign is the absolute lowest common denominator possible. You don't even say a single idea. You literally just have a name, right? And part of the way you win the election is by having more of your name on these election signs up around the neighborhood. I mean, that's not really the politics of ideas. And so, do I believe that Dimitri would have been able to win a seat in the House of Commons? No, I told him that directly. I didn't believe he would. I think maybe with time, if he ran a number of campaigns and whatever. So from a strictly electoral strategy, was the Green Party going to be more likely to win seats with Dimitri or than Anamie? I think in the short term, quite frankly, probably more likely to win with Anamie. Maybe medium and long term things could change, but so those are some of the dynamics. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't, from the standpoint of making a better world, to have a activist-oriented Green Party that had 2 seats in the House of Commons is going to be better for making Canada and the world a better place than having 4 Green MPs and basically just another NDP, right? So those are some of the dynamics at play that went into the decision making, but I think I haven't had an opportunity to talk to Dimitri or Meryam. I don't actually know Meryam, but about their sense of the campaign. But I get the impression that it was obviously a devastating loss, but the whole process. Dimitri, I don't think is happy by the whole process, the level of support. There clearly is support. There's clearly a lot of thousands, tens of thousands of activist-minded Canadians who are unhappy with the NDP, or unhappy with the Green Party leadership. They see that there are these massive problems, and there's not really any sort of major organized force that is putting forward some of the solutions to those problems. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, they'll be curious to see what happens next if all those members that Dimitri and Meryam Haddad inspired will still say, well, he almost won, and hey, we are pretty much tired of the NDP, and all those people who fell for the con of Trudeau probably are saying, well, let's stay with this party because the liberal parties are a fraud. Now we've read the Trudeau formula of Martin Lukács. We've read Yves Engler's book, so let's still use the Green Party as a vehicle. But yeah, we'll see what happens. All I know is that the Liberals and the NDPs are definitely very happy with an Anamie Paul victory as opposed to a Dimitri victory, or even Meryam Haddad. But as you told me, that was very much a very, very long shot, just like when Tulsi Gabbard was running for the Democratic nomination. Bernie still had that level of popularity, but anywho. But all right, on to the second topic I wanted to talk to you about, which is Israel, which and all things Israel. Now, I'm not going to ask you to talk to us about the history of how Canada has not been an honest broker in the Israel-Palestine ongoing crisis. I think anyone who has seen my interviews with you knows that Canada is not a force for good in the world, and if Canada's not been a force for good in all those countries, Congo, Rwanda, South Africa, Latin America, then they're definitely not a force for good in Israel, Palestine. But I did want to talk to you a little bit about Israel because, so I wanted to talk so let's talk about Canada and Israel. I was very surprised when I read your book that Christian-Zionism, which everybody knows in the United States, that the Christian right, big supporters of Israel for their crazy biblical reasons, a lot of it just naked racist reasons, and we all know that white supremacist movements now see Israel as as a model, and even though they think that the Jews control the economic system and all that crazy, disgusting stuff, they do see Israel as the perfect model. So many of them do support Zionism, or as I prefer to call it, Ultra Zionism and Jewish supremacy. But so that movement has always been there in the U.S., particularly in the 80s with the Reagan Revolution. But I had no idea that Canada, even though we know that Canada is not a force for good in the world, but that you guys had a much longer Christian Zionist movement. Do you want to talk a bit about that for people?
Well, I mean, it's not just a Canadian thing. I mean, Zionism begins as a Christian movement, right? In the late 1600s, it comes out of the Protestant Reformation and the more literal readings of the Bible. And there's actually a Christian Zionist movement for a couple centuries before there's any substantial Jewish Zionist movement. And in Canada's case, the preeminent Zionist was a man by the name of Henry Wentworth Monk at around the time of Confederation, 1867, so the 1850s, 60s, 70s. And he was pushing, because Canada, of course, was a dominion of the British Empire, and increasingly in the late 1800s, the British saw in the Zionist movement a tool to control the region, particularly after they took control of Egypt in 1882. They saw Zionist movement as potentially serving their geostrategic interests. So that movement sort of got going in Britain, and Henry Wentworth Monk was calling for a dominion of Israel alongside the dominion of Canada, South Africa, Australia, as part of the British Empire, and so he was pushing forward a kind of mix of biblical rationale and British geostrategic rationale, and he was reflecting some prominent individuals in Britain, and so there's I quote in that book a number of speeches that different Canadian prime ministers in the early 1900s made that were supportive of Zionism, that again put forward a mix of Christian biblical rationale with pro-British kind of thinking. And so Canada, I think more than the US at that time, was very sympathetic to Zionism, and because the Zionism could be aligned with British imperial support for British imperialism, the Jewish community was also more sympathetic towards Zionism in Canada than it was in the U.S. because, or particularly elite sectors of the Jewish community, because that could align with just being a good citizen of the British Empire. And then Canada today, the evangelical movement, which is the thrust of Christian Zionism.
That's the movement I was referring to in the 80s that got the Reagan Revolution pushed. Yeah, those were the people I was referring to.
And that's a smaller proportion of the Canadian population. It's I think some polls put it at as much as 30% of Americans are evangelicals, and in Canada I think it's usually viewed as something closer to 10% of the population, and they tend to be the most sympathetic among Christians towards Israel and Zionism, and there's an organized movement that's often tied into the American Christian Zionist movement in Canada, and it mostly goes below the radar in official politics. I think it was more influential within the Stephen Harper government. You saw some of that play out within the Stephen Harper government. I think less so with Justin Trudeau's government. But yeah, so there is, that's one of the forces. There's a whole series of forces that are driving Canada towards being so anti-Palestinian and supportive of Israel, and that's one of those forces.
Before I get into the second question about Israel and Palestine, talk to us about the anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant movement in Canada, which actually rejected European Jews from fleeing, how also the persecution that was mounting with Nazi Germany. Can you talk to us about how the Canadian how Canadian society actually said we don't want any Jewish refugees from the pogroms or from Nazism to come to our country, but hey, if they want, why don't they just go to Palestine?
Yeah, so I mean, Canada's history, there is a history early 1900s into the 1950s of institutional anti-Semitism. So you have, McGill University having quotas on Jewish students for their medical program. You have land deeds in exclusive neighborhoods that say no Jews, Black people, or Asian people allowed. So you have institutional anti-Jewishness for decades. I say, like, globally speaking, or compared to Europe, it's on a much lesser scale than many European countries, obviously, most notably Germany, but there is a significant historical anti-Semitism in the 30s. How that played itself out in the 30s was you had a time when many European Jews were fleeing rising Nazism, fascism. You have basically what was dubbed a none is too many immigration policy of we don't want any Jewish refugees to enter Canada. In effect, it wasn't exactly a none. It wasn't a zero, but it's I think it's something like 6,000 or 8,000 Jews were allowed into Canada between mid-1930s and mid-1940s. Some people have said that was as bad a record as any country in the world. Right. There was also restrictions on Jewish refugees into the U.S. My understanding, I don't know much about that history, but it was not quite as restrictive as Canadian policy. And there's famous examples of Jews that try to come to Canada, then are forced back to Europe, and then are killed. That, of course, the beneficiaries of that, in part, was the Zionist movement, because when most Jews in Europe wanted to immigrate to North America, and they were blocked from doing so, and so Palestine became a place to go, against their will to a large extent. In the post-World War II period, you have hundreds of thousands of displaced European Jews who are looking to go somewhere. And again, you have Canada being restrictive of allowing them in. And
even after World War II and after everything was known about the Holocaust.
Even after World War II, I mean, I don't know if the whole scale was 100% known or whatever, but the broad outlines are pretty clear. You have commentary by Canadian officials at that period in the 1946-47 period, when the question of Palestine starts becoming a hot political issue and what to do with it. You have Canadian officials who are basically wanting the Jewish refugee question to be dealt with Palestine, and you have officials from other countries, from Arab countries, predominantly Muslim countries, saying, "Hey, Canada, you're saying that this really small sliver of land in Palestine should be taking all these European Jewish refugees, but you're not willing to open your doors, and you have obviously there's much more land and much greater capacity, and you want the Palestinians to be sort of compensate, if you like, European Jewry for what the Nazis did." And of course, Canadian officials were, as they are today, two-faced in this stuff, and were big hypocrites, and those I think those criticisms probably led to a certain degree of discomfort, but they continued to pursue a policy of basically creating a Jewish state on Palestinian land. And one of the excuses they sort of gave was, well, these European Jewish refugees need to go somewhere. And Canada played a central role at the UN, at the United Nations, in the process of creating a Jewish state on Palestinian land, and one that was they push the partition plan and the most unjust versions of the partition plan of giving the Jewish community, the Zionist movement, maximalist amounts of Palestine, and that's the worst. I mean, Canada has continued to be supportive of Zionism in Israel, but that was the worst contribution to Palestinian dispossession was Canada's role in the UN negotiations and in the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine that went to the region to come up with a solution to the British mandate. And Canadian policy at that time was overwhelmingly driven by a dance between Britain and the U.S. Right, Britain was the colonial force, and wanting to sort of extract itself from the growing problem, and the U.S. was generally supportive of Zionism, and Lester Pearson specifically. Very much aligned with U.S. policy on the creation of Palestine or creation of Israel.
Wow. Then before we get into the issues of Palestine solidarity, because I have some issues with Palestine solidarity groups and the whole issue of the whole socialist, liberal, progressive on everything except Palestine. Yeah, just very quickly, who do you think in all of your studies on real Canadian history, who do you think has been the worst prime minister when it comes to all things Israel, and who do you think was not good, but at least there was room for improvement?
Well, I mean, I think Stephen Harper was the worst on Palestine because it was so stark, and it was, at a time when it was already being politicized, and also the Lester Pearson in many ways is the worst, but it was prior to him becoming prime minister. It was when he was a top diplomat, and then and when he was external minister, Stephen Harper was quite radical on the issue and was really pushing a very explicit anti-Palestinian. Now, the least anti-Palestinian Canadian prime minister is probably Pierre Trudeau or Jean Chrétien. Chrétien is interesting, right? Like Jean Chrétien, like we like on UN votes. He actually voted in favor of Palestinian rights at the UN. That's now the Trudeau government, Justin Trudeau government, votes against almost every resolution that almost every country in the world supports that uphold Palestinian rights. Chrétien actually voted for a big chunk of those resolutions, and Justin Trudeau today is not even abstaining; he's voting against, right? So he's taking a very strong position in the other direction. But Chrétien also signed the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, right? The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement is not only was there's not much trade between Canada and Israel. Distance makes it so it's not that much trade. So it was a heavily political agreement, and it includes products produced in Israeli settlements.
Yeah.
In the West Bank, so it allow, in the European Union Free Trade Agreement doesn't officially allow those products to enter the EU, tariff free. So it even provides a sort of acceptance of the Israeli occupation. But again, that's the least anti-Palestinian prime minister where that was signed. So.
And before I get into because you and me were not afraid to criticize the left. So before we get into that, are we going to be seeing the end of Palestine as we know it with the Gulf states, which were never that anti-Israel and pro-Palestine to begin with? They do a lot of trading with Israel. Israel's deep states helps Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries, and how to oppress their people and keep them in line, especially their minority populations. But now it is official that just like when Egypt made their peace with Israel, the Gulf states are more or less doing that. And with Netanyahu, who says he's going to make all of those illegal settlements, he's going to basically annex the West Bank. And of course, that and the issue of East Jerusalem. Are we seeing the end of Palestine as we know it?
Well, I mean, I think the Palestinians have just had their land and the viability of a state chipped away at for decades and decades and years after year, and Israel continues to take more Palestinian land on a daily or weekly basis, and their standing, or their Israel standing, has really improved, while the Palestinian standing has worsened from the standpoint of the region and the geopolitics of the region. I mean, the Middle East has just been so divided, and Iran is now like supposedly the big enemy of most Arab countries, and that's just all ends up working in Israel's favor. Who knows? I think concurrently you have greater consciousness and active solidarity for Palestinians in North America and in Europe than previously.
Many Jewish communities, on top of that, speaking out forcefully against Israel. You have all these what they call Jewish anti-Zionist groups that are all speaking out against Israel and rightly denouncing it as an ethno-states, a Jewish supremacist state, an Ultra Zionist state, even if some still do believe in some form of Zionism.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of different degrees of opposition to Israel or Zionism among different Jewish organizations. Some that are anti-Zionist, and some that are more just critical of the Netanyahu and the occupation of the West Bank and stuff like that. But yes, there's no doubt there's a breaking up. I'd say probably more in the U.S. than in Canada. I think the Jewish community in Canada is still more clearly behind Israeli policy than in the U.S.
Okay.
But there's lots of polls that show that like Canadian Jews have much greater connection to Israel than American Jews. They go to Israel more often. They have more family members. It's
come on, it's just because of the weather, right?
I think there's a whole series of reasons to do with like which currents of the Jewish religion that people follow, to a lot of the American Jewish community is earlier in terms of when they emigrated to the U.S. or like they came in earlier waves. But yeah, so there's growing dissatisfaction within the Jewish community in North America. There's just more generally there's a growing pro-Palestinian movement. Partly there's I think more there are more Arabs, more Palestinians in Canada or the U.S. than there was previously. There's just the work over years and decades that people have done has just grown the Palestine Solidarity movement. Part of it is just the obviousness of it all, and that Israel tries to frame itself as the victim, but I mean this is like a nuclear armed state that is clearly this huge military, economic, even at this point, power. So those arguments of David versus Goliath kind of arguments that were never made sense, but it just seemed kind of preposterous at this point. And just the open racism. I mean, Netanyahu was pretty explicit about there's even within Israel proper that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israelis, if you like, are second-class citizens, and that's pretty explicit. I mean, the long-standing. I talk about this in my book. Like a good friend growing up in Vancouver Michael Rosen, who never been to Israel, had no family members in Israel, tomorrow he can become an Israeli citizen. Whereas this woman I meet at Concordia, whose grandparents were driven out in 1948, she couldn't even go to Israel, let alone go back to her family's home, get her family's home back until she became a Canadian citizen. Right, and so there's just these are incredible fundamental racism of how Israel works, and these are elements that don't even get talked about. I mean, there's the more obvious, of course, are what's going on in the West Bank and mistreatment in Gaza, and so there's growing dissent, but as you pointed out, there still is a current of progressive but Palestine. And that current is you see it most obviously within the Jewish community, but it's not just something that's not just a problem within the Jewish community. It's broader, and it's a problem. It's something that needs to be broken down. It's tied into all kinds of facets to it. There is just the whole part of it is nationalism, right? Part of it is white supremacy and viewing Palestinians as others. But part of it is also that there is a perception of Jews as being oppressed or being a mistreated minority, and I think that a lot of those ideas, there is anti-Semitism out there, and it is consequential. But the reality is that the Jewish community in Canada is not an oppressed community. In fact, if you look at it, the social economic indicators, the Jewish community does better education-wise, has higher.
Just like Quebecers are not institutionally discriminated, and they're not that much of a colony of Canada, even though they often use that card and then use that card to oppress their own Muslim and Black population and Indigenous population.
And it provides a blunt, like in the case of the Québécois, it provides a blunt for like legitimate criticism of institutional racism. I mean, that's something that you've seen in a really intense way in the last couple of weeks, where you have this horrific racist incident at a hospital where an Indigenous woman literally Facebooks her dying, her final minutes dying, and you have a nurse and an orderly saying racist things about her as she's basically dying in the hospital bed. And you have the Premier of Quebec saying, no, we don't have any problem with institutional, there's no institutional systemic racism in Quebec.
Even though last year he actually apologized to the Quebec Indigenous people for centuries of institutional racism.
Yeah, but in this case, it's just really clear that it's this, like, it's tied to this idea of Quebecois being victims of Quebec nationalism, and to concede that would be to deny the history of Anglo dominance in Quebec or whatnot. But that's also that similar. It's not the exact same thing, but it's a similar type of dynamic that plays out with the Jewish community in Canada. And there's many people on the left who are, I think, quite frankly, a bit out to lunch, if you like, when it comes to their level of prioritization on a sense of like Jewish victimhood, which in a sort of at an abstract level is, I think, kind of fine, But when you bring in the fact that this claims of Jewish victimhood is being used to basically oppress Palestinians, now becomes quite a significant problem. And I would say it even goes, it goes into beyond that. And as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, there's this dynamic playing out where one of the ways, an important way to divide the left, is to basically make either completely fallacious accusations of anti-Semitism, or to just drastically exaggerate errors,
acts of anti-Semitism,
and mistakes or whatever. But so this dynamic is something that contributes to the whole progressive, except for Palestine. Some part of it is just quite frankly just cowardice in the level of, you have politicians who are like, yeah, they know full well that Palestinians are being terribly oppressed, but they just don't want to be labeled anti-Semitic, and so they just keep their mouth shut and prioritize whatever else they prioritize, and that's something that's, I think, including among left-wing politicians, labor leaders. I mean, I've been in meetings when I worked at the Communications Energy Paperworkers Union. I was told very explicitly by the assistant to the president that didn't want to pick a fight with the Israel lobby, and the president of the union. I wrote op-eds and stuff on behalf of the president of the union, and he told me explicitly one issue he didn't want, just don't touch Palestine. He was actually into it, mostly as a domestic issues anyways, but he was into a couple of international issues, but he's like, don't touch Palestine. Every time I ever mention that, I get heat, and so it plays out at many different levels, but big picture, continues to be this important element of progressive, except for Palestine.
Perfect segue into now. Before I want to criticize Palestinian solidarity groups, but before I do that, let's talk about that issue. The progressive, socialist, liberal, and everything except Palestine. You yourself, when you were a student at Concordia and head of the student union, you actually were kicked out of the school for your activism and organizing counter protests against that scumbag warmonger and human trafficker Bibi Netanyahu coming into Concordia. As you guys know, I really don't like Netanyahu. I myself was a reporter for Black Agenda Reports covering the Labour Party conference, and I got a front row seat into the smear campaign, pro Ultra Zionist groups, the pro Israel lobby, shutting down a group of academics who come out with a book to debunk all of this nonsense that there was an anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party. Waterstone was forced to cancel that. It had to go to this theater hall that a bunch of brave Jewish pro-Corbyn people were organizing, who got tons of hate mail, death threats, bomb threats. I personally, spent 4 days with Jackie Walker, Tony Greenstein, and a bunch of wonderful Jewish, I have to emphasize this, Jewish anti-Zionist folks who were all slandered as anti-Semites, kicked out of the Labour Party for being anti-Semites, even though they were Jewish, even though, anyone who could clearly see the propaganda from The Guardian and so forth could be like, wait a minute, but they're Jewish. And yeah, Carlos Latouf's poster where you have Jeremy Corbyn, speaking, and then you have Netanyahu bombing Jeremy Corbyn. That was considered anti-Semitism. But the issue, the real tragedy, though, about that whole thing and the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn is not how powerful the smear campaign was, but it was that you had Jeremy Corbyn himself, John McDonnell himself, the entire leadership and these pro-Corbyn lefty outlets like Navarro Media, all of them who I would call, the pseudo-left outlets, were all saying, yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis. We're dealing with it. Yes, that poster was anti-Semitic. Yes, Jackie Walker, anti-Semitic. Therefore, she should be kicked out of Momentum. Chris Williamson, who was saying, hey, we don't have that big of an anti-Semitism crisis, and we're actually the party that's been fighting against anti-Semitism and racism since our inception, kicked out of the Labour Party. And again, the fact that you had Jeremy Corbyn himself, who has the best CV when it comes to, anti-war, anti-imperialism, and social justice campaigns, he was saying, yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis. We're dealing with it, giving complete ammunition to all of his enemies. And then, wow, you wonder why he didn't win. And what's your reflection on that? Because that goes to show you that we still have this problem of the progressive, socialist, liberal, and everything against except Palestine, and people, and again, this cowardice to just call BS on the smear campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that by conceding the groups that are pushing this, they are not pushing this because they're concerned about anti-Jewishness. They're pushing this because they have political agenda, mostly tied to Israel and just Israel, no matter what type of outlook. I think in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, it went way beyond the question of Palestine, and it was what his enemies saw as the best way to weaken him and the movement that was that's rallying with him, and there's been many examples of that. Nothing at the level of extremeness of what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, but of that type of dynamic playing out in Canadian politics. And you have Nikki Ashton, when she ran for the head of the NDP on a left-wing platform.
Twice, right?
Yeah, but in the second one, where she looked like she was having some more traction, B'nai B'rith went at her. You have examples during the Quebec student strike in 2012, a massive, huge outpouring of student strike. B'nai B'rith jumped in and just to totally claim that a chant that it was SSPVM, the mocking of the Montreal police, kind of linking the Montreal police like totalitarian to Nazis, that this was some sort of affront to Jews. I mean, so there are many examples of the pro-Israel groups and some of the right-wing forces basically seeing the charge of anti-Semitism as a way to weaken the left, to weaken radical left movements. And again, this is not being motivated by a concern for Jewish rights in Canada. This is tied into, and it's so if that's what's happening, the worst thing to do is to concede to it, right? To throw bones and say, oh yeah, there is a problem. No, there isn't a problem. And I mean, it's not to say that there is no instances of anti-Jewishness among the left or among pro-Palestinian people or whatever, but to frame this thing, to frame it as some sort of in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, a crisis. No, there was no crisis. In fact, there are some polls that looked into this. In fact, there's less anti-Jewish sentiment among the Labour left than there is in the conservative right. And so, but all the focus goes onto Corbyn because again, it's about weakening. Politically, and my reading, I didn't follow the Corbyn stuff that well, but probably as close as you did. But there were a number of other efforts to go at Corbyn around the whole Trident. There are other attacks. Oh, he doesn't care about our security. There were a whole bunch of other smears of Corbyn that they tried to employ over the years.
It was an entire deep state coup.
Yeah, and but it was the anti-Semitism one, which was what they latched onto as the most successful uh, um, uh, kind of sort of smear campaign, and I think that's something that people left-wing movements elsewhere need to be cognizant of, and to need to think through strategies of resisting, because that type of smear campaign is coming. They even began that process with Bernie Sanders, right? When they look like Bernie Sanders was about to win. I mean, Bernie Sanders is, he has Jewish heritage, and he's even sort of stereotypically Brooklyn Jewish, and they still even tried that.
Survived and also had family perished in the Holocaust.
Family perished in the Nazi Holocaust as well. So this this is, it doesn't. I mean, obviously there's degrees to which it can be effective and stuff like that. But if they're going to try that effort at Bernie Sanders, it's going to come to basically any left-wing movement. And part of it is not, in the case like Bernie Sanders wasn't even particularly pro-Palestinian. He has a history of being Zionist, pro-Zionist. He gotten better in recent years. But basically, I think the understanding is that, like, the type of forces that Bernie Sanders, the political forces that he empowers and that he kind of unleashes, if you like, in a certain sense, that crowd tends to be anti-imperialist or more anti-imperialist, and people who tend to be anti-imperialist tend to be critical of Israeli treatment of Palestinians. So the pro-Israel groups are cognizant of that, and they obviously want to keep those types of forces bottled up. And they've gone after Black Lives Matters and all kinds of different left social movements that they've gone after. So it's a real issue, and it's not an easy one to deal with. But it needs
but your advice for I mean, heaven forbid that we see the end of Palestine as we know it, with Israel fully annexing the West Bank. That's going to create a humanitarian crisis and a refugee crisis unlike anything we've ever seen. If people thought Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq is bad, yeah, wait until you get a load of the refugee crisis we're going to have, as Palestinians basically have to flee because they cannot live anymore under an explicitly ultra Zionist state. But your advice to people who because I don't know if you know this, but I have knots in my stomach right now because I have friends from Israel, many of them ultra Zionists, many of them pro Netanyahu, some who even think that Netanyahu is too soft when it comes to the international community, who condemn him, if you can believe that. And yeah, and I always have just this fear of when I'm going to touch Israel-Palestine. But whatever, if people don't want to be friends anymore and they want to unfriend me, okay, go right ahead. Because it was just so sad to be at the Labour Party conference last year and to see so many wonderful social justice warriors, anti-racist warriors, anti-imperialists, and again, I have to say, all of them Jewish, who were speaking out against Israel, doing all of the right things, making sure that their languages was very careful. Sometimes I don't even like it when people talk about Zionism. Just say Ultra Zionism and just say Jewish supremacy as opposed to Zionism, because. But anywho, it was sad to see so many of them be demoralized, be slandered. And I could tell that I knew that Labor was going to win, that Labor was going to lose the election, that was going to be a massacre. And I was talking with some of these elderly, Trotskyist, journalists and so forth, and I was saying, is this really the end of like the Corbyn Project? He's not standing up against the smear campaigns, and he's he's caving in to second referendums and stuff like that. Many of them said, well, yeah, this probably is the end, but we have no other we have no other lefty vehicle. You even had this Palestinian British MP from the Liberal Democrats, Layla Moran, who she was a math teacher at my old middle school, and she was calling Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters a bunch of, saying that they had an anti-Semitism crisis. And this is a Palestinian a half Palestinian Jordanian person who knows full well, wow, that's pretty cynical politics that you're doing, and you liberal Democrats aren't even ever going to be a challenger to the ruling Tory party. And she did that, and to see Jeremy Corbyn not call BS about it, I mean, it just, doesn't that show that we still do have that cowardice problem amongst the left and the anti-imperial movement?
It does. I mean, it was total cowardice. I think there was some sort of strategic decision made that if we just say, oh yeah, there's a problem, we're going to try to deal with it and hope it just would go away. But that was never the objective of those who were pushing the line. Their objective was to destroy, not to deal with a supposed problem, right? And Corbyn conceded too much, and it ultimately was a serious tactical error, let alone a moral failure. But I actually I have to do another interview in a few minutes, so I have to.
Oh. Okay. Well then. Well then. Just in closing. Okay. Yeah, we need to grow a pair of balls. The next time I have you on, we'll talk about some of the issues I have with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So the next time we have you on, let's talk about that. But and then there was a question there I wanted to do with you. But Yves, where do you get your optimism though? Because I read your first book, your autobiography, all about activism, and I just have to ask, this last question then, which is, where do you get your optimism then that things will get better and that keep on fighting and keep on speaking out?
Well, I mean, if you look at history, and I do that in that book, there's all kinds of things that we take for granted today that we only have because there were people over decades, over centuries who fought for those things. And I'm thankful that there's people who fought to undermine legal racism, to have a 40-hour work week, to fight against nuclear weapons, and so those we have those movements have not always been successful, but if you look at the long trajectory, there are these amazing improvements that come from people sacrificing, and for myself, there is sacrifice, of course, that goes into the struggle, but compared to the sacrifice that people have made historically, I was thinking about people doing a book on Canada's role in Haiti and thinking about the Haitian Revolution and the people who fought to end the Haitian Revolution. Most of those people, I don't know. I was just thinking about if there's a study of this, it'd be very difficult to do. But did those people's lives, was it worth it? Almost half of the people who rose up in the Haitian Revolution, they died in the 13 years. So from that standpoint, you just look at it from that standpoint, it was probably not worth it for them personally. Clearly, for humanity, and particularly for Black people, but for humanity in general, what they did was this incredible gift to humanity, and so obviously, I mean, these are conditions that make difficulties of activism today seem like totally irrelevant. But yeah, so the process of it's not always going to be better for you in the short term, but if you believe in it, it's better for maybe you in the medium term, but also for your descendants, for your friends, for humanity, so that's I think I take inspiration from those types of looking back historically, and And I quite frankly, I enjoy it. I mean, I find looking at people, I know old friends that aren't really engaged, and I find to me there gives some meaning to life. But unfortunately, I'm actually getting
all right. Playing left wing from rink rack to student radical. People need to get this book. Yves Engler, thank you so much for joining us on 1+1. We'll do another follow-up interview sometime in the next 2 weeks, and thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks, Youri. Take care.